Now we're going to start talking about maturity, this second component of the tool. What is EVMS maturity? If you recall, Ed shared with us this particular visual yesterday, where our earned value management system is made up of 10 particular processes or sub-processes that go from organizing all the way to risk management. But then they're not alone, right? There's other things that influence and are influenced by the system. And these are the environment categories that we covered yesterday: culture, people, practices, and resources. Another way of looking at this tool, against different visual, trying to show the same thing, but different people learn a little bit differently. So you can think of two components: maturity on the left, environment on the right. Maturity has 10 sub-processes. Environment has 4 categories. Yesterday, we looked on the right side of the screen. Today, we're going to focus on the left side of the screen, drilling a little bit deeper into the maturity assessment, the 10 sub-processes, and the 56 attributes that make up maturity. Again, this is a slide, a quick reminder. We showed you that at a very high level yesterday. Maturity is the degree to which an implemented system, its associated processes and deliverables serve as a basis for effective and compliant EVMS. Notice it's not only about compliant EVMS. Effective is as important, if not more important. And by that, we mean, are we helping manage the project effectively and leading to better outcomes? And again, as I mentioned before, we have some data to show that. If we drill a little bit deeper into these 10 sub-processes, they're made up of anywhere from 2 to 12 attributes, a total of 56. Each one of these 56 will be evaluated according to a particular table. We'll share with you one here in just a little bit. And then we'll evaluate each one of them. These levels of maturity will reflect particular scores. These scores will all be added together and will make up a score for the whole maturity of your EVMS out of 1,000. Okay, we saw a corollary to that yesterday in environment. So this is going to go fairly similarly. Each sub-process will have a table that basically looks like this. It's got all the attributes that belong to the sub-process. Here, for example, sub-process H has material management attributes. There's 5 of them, from H1 all the way to H5. And then we're going to evaluate each one of them according to the details of that particular attribute. We'll show you an example here. Ed will show you an example here in just a minute. We will put an X mark where we feel this particular project is, and then we'll be able to convert that into scores for maturity of our project. These are the particular steps, similar to how we had steps for environment. We have steps for maturity. We recommend that you read the description for each attribute. We'll show you one here in just a bit. It's a table. You can do that in the software or in Appendix C if you're using the paper version, right? We have both versions as we discussed yesterday. Once you have a good understanding of that description, we'll talk about how we do that. We'll collect all the input needed to properly evaluate and select maturity for each attribute. Generally, maturity is something that we would like to reach consensus around. So your team that's evaluating EVMS maturity, whether it's made up of 5 people or of 12 or 20 people, ideally, we'd like to reach consensus around, is this a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or 5? And we have details that tell you which level this most closely resembles for each one of these attributes. You'll select that maturity level, and then you'll select the score that corresponds to the level of maturity. These scores came out of our research, and the intent is something that scores, twice as much as another attribute, perhaps is twice as likely to impact your outcomes for that project, right? So not all of them are created equal. That's why there's a score for each one. We didn't just divide the 1,000 points by 56 attributes. Some are more important than others. We add the attribute scores to obtain sub-process scores. In this case, for sub-process H, how much did it score? The software is really nice because it automatically does all of that for us and adjusts as needed. And then finally, as we discussed yesterday, most importantly, we got to take action. We're not doing it for the score. We're doing it to identify gaps and see what we can do about them to improve our project. Ed, I will hand it over to you. If possible, you could walk us through an example of how we can apply this on a particular project.
Yeah, before we get into the example, if you go back to the previous page, I did want to just reiterate that yesterday when we did environment, can you go back to there you go, thank you. When we did the environment assessment, because a number of those issues are fairly sensitive, we felt like it was better to actually have each individual fill out an environment assessment. And with the help of a facilitator, obviously going through each of the 27 factors that make up the environment. And then we would compile or collate the responses from everyone, and that would give us an indication in general of where things are. In terms of maturity, it's a little different because these are technical issues. There really shouldn't be a lot of concern, about, stepping on any toes or anything. We're just strictly going through and figuring out exactly how mature our system is. And so these 56 attributes, make up that assessment. And so in this situation, what we want to have is a facilitator and the team evaluating this and then coming to consensus on where we are for the project or program. And so it's a little bit different assessment. And obviously there are more attributes, 56 versus 27 factors. So it takes a little longer to do this one. I think yesterday we talked about this being a three or 4 hour time frame. But the nice part is you really look at the maturity of your system from A to Z, right? It's pretty much everything as you go forward. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of set that stage for giving you an example. So let's go to the next slide now, Manir. So let's say that, and then we have an integrated project team. We have 10 or 12 or even 15 people from different disciplines evaluating the different attributes that make up the tool. In this situation, this is actually attribute H1, recording actual material costs. Many of you have been involved in this in your career. And so you'll see over here in the highlighted area to the left is actually the description of what we mean by recording actual material cost. You'll also notice at the bottom of that, the references. So this came out of a number of different references, as well as input from our steering team, our research team, as well as input from all of our workshops that we talked about yesterday as well. So a lot went into the words that are in here. There's also a glossary that we developed that is available as well in some of those documents. So if you have any questions about any of these terms, then we developed that glossary and you can actually access that to understand. Next slide, please. So the next part of this really is the maturity level across the top. And again, it's a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being low to 5 being high. You'll notice that 1 means that we haven't started developing a system to record actual material costs. 5 really we consider to be something beyond compliance, world-class, if you want to call that, something that would say that we're using this to actually manage our projects and actually forecast how we're doing. Generally 4 is where we would see this thing as in compliance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Next slide, please. So below that, you'll see what we call this the above the line assessment. You'll notice that it's actually in bold. And across the top, what you'll see is we tried to put into play 1 or 2 sentences that you can read and quickly try to bracket where you think your project or program is. And so as you would go across here, you could look at those short descriptions and you would say, okay, so I read this and I think I'm probably either a 3 or a 4 in terms of my level of maturity. And so that gives you at least a starting point so you don't have to read the whole thing. And then continue on. And then below the line, which is what we call, that's more detail. So if I'm a 3, if I bracketed down to 3 or 4, then I would actually read down below that. You can see under 3, incurred cost reports comparing the EVMS material ACWP to the accounting system. You can see issues identified during reconciliation are documented and corrected within the quarter, but this lag adversely impacts the material cost variance. Whereas you can see under 4, issues identified during reconciliation are documented, tracked to closure, accurately reported and corrected expeditiously, typically within 2 accounting periods. So you can see that as you move from left to right, the maturity level goes up. And what we say is that everything that's been done in, for instance, maturity level 3 doesn't degrade, it stays the same, but then we add on to it as we move to 4 and we move to 5. Next slide, please. You'll also notice that, as I said, 5 is usually something along these lines. Project program proactively ensures material ACWP is consistent. Metrics are documented, corrections are monitored to completion, typically within 1 accounting period. So this is what we might want to strive for on our project or program. It's beyond compliance. And you can see down below the line here, it talks about a formal process ensuring EVMS material ACWP is reconcilable. Material costs are monitored and used for management control. You'll see that language quite a bit in level 5's. Routine surveillance results of material costs are fully disclosed with all key stakeholders. You'll see similar language in a lot of the attributes in terms of level 5. And so that's kind of where that one sets up. Next slide, please. And so why don't we go back one before that? I'm sorry. I did want to make one more point. If you were in level 4, we feel like, and we were trying to be very careful about our wording in level 4, that would meet what we would consider to be in compliance with, you know, the actual guidelines that you see out there, 748 guidelines. And so that really is kind of the compliance point. And here you would be beyond compliance in level 5. Next slide, please. So we took a look at our example, the previous example, and we felt like that it was beyond compliance. We're using that information to manage our project and program with all of our systems in place. And we put some comments in, rigorous review on actuals in a timely manner. Now, obviously, we would want to go through all 56 attributes here and see how we're doing on this. And so you'll see down along the bottom here, we consider that best in class. It could have been a 4, it could have been a 3, and so on and so forth as we kind of move forward. Next slide, please. Now, if we were looking at the software, this is how it would look. You can see that it's very similar. This is actually H1 recording actual material costs. You can see the actual description is in there. And so we could be following along either on the paper version or, as we see here, with the software version. Next slide. So this is the description. Again, this is how we would analyze things. You'll notice to the left, there's a not applicable column. And there are a few attributes that may be not applicable to the project or program. And certainly you would want to make sure that if that was the case, you document why it's not applicable. You can see that above the line is kind of how you bracket, and below the line is exactly what I showed you a few moments ago. So you would, in an assessment session, actually with a facilitator, go through this, have a discussion. Everyone comes to consensus. And in this case, everyone felt like it was a level 5. So let's go to the next slide. We could actually rate it a level 5. We put in our notes, rigorous review on actuals in a timely manner. And then we could save and go to the next question. We can go backwards and so on and so forth. There are a lot of things that we can actually do as we move forward with a project. Next slide. So this is H2, material performance. We would go through a similar type of assessment on this. And in this situation, again, it seems like we're doing very well. Next slide, please. So we actually feel like we bracketed between a 4 and a 5. We had our discussion. And, you know, in our discussion, we said, yeah, we consider ourselves best in class. We're beyond compliance. We're using this information, you know, so to see how it's going to have an impact on our project. See that last sentence in the top paragraph, future material requirements are routinely evaluated to assess the potential impact to the project program, if any. So we're using this information to manage, right? Whereas 4 is compliance, we're actually compiling the information and doing things, but it doesn't go beyond just the compliance step at that point. You can see down below there, they're very similar to previous routine surveillance is in there. Material performance is continuously improved and optimized. You'll see a lot of that language in level 5s and so on and so forth. So our team felt, hey, we're pretty good here. And so let's move on to the next slide. And we gave it a 5. We didn't have to put any comments in. We could have just patted ourselves on the back, or maybe there was something minor that we wanted to work on, but we gave it a level 5. Next slide, please. So again, this is just an example of what the software looks. In this case, we didn't divide it up. This is what the screen would actually look like. You can see material performance is at the top. That's the description of what we would like to see in this particular attribute. The maturity level is down below that, again, from not applicable all the way out to level 5. And there's a button down there, and we'll show you this a little bit later when we're going through our exercise. You can actually hide the details down here if you would like to. And then you can see that we actually gave this a level 5 rating. And there actually is a note in here that we put. So you can put some notes even when everything is a 5. What we really, really want you to do, though, is if you have anything that is a level 1, 2, or 3, for sure you need to have some notes that identify any gaps, maybe some actions that need to take place. Maybe in a level 4, we would probably put some notes. Yeah, we've got all this in place. We just need to start using it, as we go through there. Next slide, please. So we went through all 5 of these attributes that make up material management. And we had 2 5s, we had a 2, a 4, and we had an NA. Because, and many times H5 is an NA. If we don't have a manufacturing requirement, we don't usually need to have unit cost and lot cost involved in that. So that was NA for this particular project or program. You'll see that we have a 2, and we identified a gap that really needs to be addressed for this project or program. Heavy equipment and shipping materials resale, surveillance results of residual material were not shared with 2 subcontractors. And then even with the level 4, we said, we've got good processes, but we're not using it and proactively sharing it. And so in terms of variances, so this would be an assessment, that we went through. Certainly we could do it on paper, but we probably would use the spreadsheet. And the reality of it is, if we did this, then we would know how we're doing in terms of our material management. Next slide, please. So we have some gaps that we've identified. Remember, H5 was not applicable. H1 and H2 were level 5s. And so here are the gaps that we've identified with material management. And that gives us an idea of what we need to work on to improve our system as we go forward. That we're not mature completely with these 2 attributes. Next slide, please. Now, if we had the software, you notice that we actually put in comments on everything. We can actually see everything that we have here. You can do the same thing, by hand as well, but it's kind of nice. In this situation, we see where the ratings are. You can see the comments. You can actually click and get more as you need them. And this provides us with a path forward. Again, remember what we're trying to do is figure out where are we today in terms of maturity of our EVMS and how that relates to integrated project and program management. So we're looking at where we are today, and this provides us with an idea of what we need to do and work on to improve. And that's a management decision, as we go forward. Certainly if we've got level 2s in our system, then we need to improve those areas. That's a consensus that we came up with in an integrated project team environment. Next slide, please. Now, As we said earlier, and Manir mentioned earlier today, and we talked about a little bit yesterday, maturity is rated on a 0 to 1,000 scale. If we look at total maturity. So if everything is level 5, then you're at 1,000. Probably no project program has ever been all at level 5. And so somewhere in here, you're kind of on that sliding scale. Now, we developed these weights through our workshops that we talked about yesterday. And so you can see if you score 5 for H1, it's 15 points. If you had scored 2, it would have been 4. Right, so manually you can actually calculate the scores, and you'll see that in the workshop a little bit later. And so we scored 5, 5, 2, 4, and A. And so what you see there is we translate 15, 15, 2, 9, and then a not applicable. There's no score that goes with that. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And so basically we scored 41 out of 59 possible points. You can see the 41 as the summation of the score column down at the bottom, and the 59 points as a summation of the level 5. Now, you also realize that we had a not applicable, so we really scored 41 out of 51 potential points on this particular category. And so that kind of gives you an idea, or sub-process, excuse me. So that kind of gives you an idea of how this scoring mechanism goes. Now, people ask me, well, where do the numbers come from? And again, they come from our workshops, and they stay the same, and they're basically associated with the columns. And so these are the scores that are associated with these 5 attributes.
And Ed,
15, 15, 2, 9, and actually 8.
If I may add to this, where do the scores come from? There's also 2 reports on the same link we shared with you. One that talks about how we got the maturity scores, and one about how we got the environment scores or weights. And so all of that is freely available as well.
That's exactly right. So it's a long, drawn-out process that we went through with input from hundreds of people. And a testing regime. We'll talk a little bit about the testing and what this means a little bit later in the session as well. Next slide. Now, if we actually had, we're using the spreadsheet, it automatically calculates this for us. It also puts a color code out to the left. You can see that. And you can see what it shows here. It didn't show H5 because it was not applicable. And you also see that the score of subprocess H was 41, and the maximum subprocess H was 51. Remember, we took away a not applicable, which had 8 points, so it went from 59 down to 51. So that gives you an idea of something that you could see in the spreadsheet, or in the software itself for this particular subprocess. And so, yeah, look at the scores. Or look at the color code. We're in red in H3. That's something that we need to work on. We're in yellow with H4, excuse me, I guess that's orange. Probably something that we can improve upon as well and use that information. So it gives you just another visual indicator of where you are. Next slide, please. Like yesterday for the environment piece, this time we have a similar type of scale for material management. And you can see kind of how this sets up. In this case, it's just green is between, is level 4 to 5, yellow is level 3 to 4, and so on and so forth. Our assessment score in this case, we're doing pretty well, except for, I think we're doing pretty well, except for residual material. We're actually at level 4 for material price usage variance. We can certainly do better there and use that information and share it more widely, but in terms of trying to figure out what path forward, we really need to focus in on residual material. And that's a consensus discussion, decision, and gap list that we've come up with through our IPT, right? So that's kind of how that sets up. Next slide, please. All right, so what do you do after you've done the maturity assessment? I think what and Manir is going to show you a little bit more information here starting next slide, but you look at what the score means. So again, you can think of it kind of on a sliding score scale, from somewhere around 0 all the way to 1,000 points. So the higher score is better. More importantly, really, is to look at individual attributes that might cause us problems, potentially the one I mentioned a moment ago with the residual materials. We can look at whole sub-process scores. In this case, we were 41 out of 51. That's not too bad. That's around 80%. So we're doing pretty well in material management. And then you can look at the vital few, and we'll show you those. Those are the ones that had the highest scores amongst all the attributes that make up the maturity tool. We can look at where our maturity is. If we look at the total maturity score for in this environment, if we're greater than 500, I mean, that's okay, but it's not good enough probably. If we're greater than 700, if we're greater than 800. So you can look at the total score. It gives you an indication of how much work you probably need to put into this to get it to the point where you want it to be. You can look at, are we doing really well in sub-process B, but we're not doing so well in sub-process H? Are there certain themes that we see through here that we're not sharing information, and so on and so forth? Are we not integrated very well amongst the different 10 sub-processes? So it gives you an idea of places to put some emphasis. And then you just work on the action items as you move forward. So that's really kind of the steps after you do the maturity assessment and evaluate all 56 of the attributes. Again, in our example, we only looked at 1 of 10 sub-processes and 5 of 56 of the attributes. Next slide. I think this goes over to you, Munir.
Thank you, Ed. And as Ed mentioned, the vital few, we named them that. These are really the top 10 attributes by weight out of 56. They're responsible for perhaps about a third of the score, something around that. And hopefully this list that's showing on the slide, isn't very surprising at all, because any one of these, if not done well, can derail a project. J1 and J2 are around risk, identify and analyze risk, and also risk integration. The sub-process around risk was an addition that we've put together as part of this project. I don't think it was a guideline of sorts in some of the literature that we saw, but the team felt that was very important to add. And indeed, the weights of these were really high. Critical path and flow, management analysis and corrective actions, estimates at completion, time phase performance measurement baseline, integrated system with common structures, incorporating change in a timely manner, a product-oriented WBS, and then authorized time-phased work scope. So these 10 had the highest weights out of all 56 attributes. Ed also mentioned NA, right? That last attribute that he went over, H5, around unit cost, was not applicable. And noticed what he did there mentally. He took these 8 points out of the total, right? It was out of 51 as opposed to being out of 59. And that's basically how NAs are handled calculation-wise, and that's what the software does. So now, instead of having, say, 41 points out of 59 points, it's really 41 points out of 51 points, so roughly about 80%, not 70%, because these NAs shouldn't count against that particular score, or shouldn't really inflate the score either. So that's how we look at them. We look at it relatively. So assume that there's, out of the 1,000 points, perhaps there's 100 points worth of NAs. Whatever score the project gets is really now out of 900, not out of 1,000. So it's relative to the total score that applies, total potential applicable scores. Couple things you want to do if you really identify an attribute as truly, we say truly not applicable. You want to make sure that you identify it as an A on the sheet, whether it's on paper or in the software. And in the comments, do provide a justification. It's not something that, we didn't feel like doing. It's something that's truly not applicable. And that's important. So we asked for a justification for why that is. For example, we have some attributes around subcontractors. Well, if there's no subcontractors, that's a justification there. It's truly not applicable. The example here was around unit cost. Well, if it's not unit cost based, then it's truly not applicable. Ed, feel free to jump in at any point if needed. This is just a quick example of the calculation here. where we have, you know, all, if it was scoring all fives, your total would be 60. But then if something is not applicable, the 19, the 22, and the additional 19, these 60, we take them out of the 1,000 points. And so now whatever we score is not out of 1,000, it's really out of 940 moving forward. So it's a percentage based.
Yeah, just like the example I gave a few moments ago where we didn't do unit cost, that was 8 points that, you know, if that was the only not applicable in the whole tool as you went through, then your total score would be out of a total of 992. So all we do is basically just adjust percentage wise, and it actually makes the score a little bit higher as you go through. So it just kind of, the tool does this in the background for you. If you're doing this, you know, by hand on the paper version, then you have to actually take this into consideration. In most cases, it doesn't change the score very much unless you have lots of not applicables. You know, so, but the software does this for you, and it's really just a way of trying to take into consideration that if something's not applicable, it's not going to provide any risk to us. It's not something that we have to deal with. So let's take it out of the equation, right? I mean, that's really what we're doing here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you, Ed.